was affecting the Indo-Pacific region, particularly South Asia. And so in some ways, today we're back to our core area of the Indo-Pacific. And what a time to be discussing the Indo-Pacific, just days after the Quad foreign ministers met in New Delhi and against a backdrop of renewed US-China engagement following discussion between President Trump and President Xi in Beijing. That was much looked forward to after it was postponed. And policymakers and analysts, are posing critical questions. Is the Quad entering a new phase of strategic coordination? How are Washington, New Delhi, Tokyo, Canberra balancing deterrence with diplomacy to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific as it's been codified before? And what is the current trajectory of US-China relations? Because a lot was said after the Trump-Xi summit, what was made out of it, and what it means for the Indo-Pacific. So, and of course, we have the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore that, of course, has added to the conversation about the importance of the Quad, broader security cooperation and stability in the region. But to unpack all of this, I only have the questions. The answers are with a few of our friends. Sumona Guha, Senior Director at Third Way. Welcome to the show, first timer. Dr. Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, who has been here before. Ken Moriyasu, who's been here before, but in a new hat, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. So congratulations, Ken, on the new hat. And Dr. Nishank Motwani, also in a new hat, Vice President of Levenhall. Welcome to you all. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas from USISPF, and just some housekeeping rules. These conversations are being recorded and will be on a YouTube platform. They are currently being live streamed. So in case you missed something, you can always go revisit this as well. I'm going to start with a few questions, and please feel free to keep your question in the chat box, name and affiliation if you can, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the limited time frame. So Sumon, I want to start with you. Good morning to you. I want to take you back to 2021. A year you remember very well, the work you remember very well. President Biden was the first president to convene an in-person level of the Quad summit, like at leaders level, which many viewed as the beginning of this new phase of strategic coordination in the Indo-Pacific. And this was in the midst of the raging pandemic. Who can forget all the four principles en masse? The Quad was seen as a force for good with vaccine delivery being discussed. You were senior director for South Asia at the NSC, and you sat at the exact institutional intersection where the Quad was transformed from strong diplomatic dialogue to the cornerstone of Indo-Pacific security. And since then, we've always looked forward to some form of Quad leader summit. In the 2 decades that the Quad first came about, and next year will be 2 decades, there's been a lot of talk on which party held it back. Initially, it was Australia when Sino-Australia ties were seen as close. India, with its strategic autonomy, has always raised eyebrows. But where is the US calculation now, given Secretary Rubio's visit to India, reassured America's commitments to maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific? So I just wanted to know what your perspective was.
Sure. Well, good morning and good evening. Thanks very much for having me. When I think about the question you asked, there really are quite a lot of elements here. I mean, of course, the fact that Secretary Rubio traveled to New Delhi and together with India and Japan and Australia negotiated a very substantive foreign minister's statement. It's clear that Washington believes that the Quad is worth saving. But what's unclear to me, at least, is whether it will command leaders level attention again anytime soon. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Of course, you all may recall that in 2025, last year, New Delhi was slated to host the Quad Summit, and there was a lot of anticipation of President Trump traveling to New Delhi for that summit. And there, given the tension between the United States and India, particularly with respect to their bilateral free trade agreement, the window of opportunity for that summit did not arrive. And of course, the US posture towards China is changing undeniably, and we'll get into that in more detail later on in the discussion. And on the Indo-Pacific more broadly, too, there is considerable uncertainty in where the United States stands. We saw that the Trump administration and its national security strategy prioritized the Western Hemisphere and somewhat deprioritized China. And the president's trip to Beijing, yielded sort of mixed results. The visit itself was the deliverable. So on both of those fronts, I'd say, there is considerable uncertainty, but the signal we can take is that the administration thinks the Quad is worth saving.
That's a key point to segue to Tanvi right now. The administration feels the Quad's worth saving. So, Tanvi, Secretary Rubio, we remember on day one of the job after inauguration, convened the same delegation with his counterparts, and at that point, it sort of set the agenda, the Indo-Pacific agenda for the new administration. But the last time the leaders met was, during President Biden's outgoing term. It was sort of seen as a last hurrah for the president during the Delaware discourse. There hasn't been a meeting of the principals in the Trump administration, and you and Nishank recently on a panel. One of the good points you mentioned was, while it was important, the Quad was elevated to a leaders level meeting, as Sumona touched on. But you don't think that's a defining factor. There's an element of substance over style. You mentioned that the efficacy of the Quad will be measured by what it does, not when and where at what level it meets. And I want to ask you, apropos of the fact of four, we talk about Quad being four, the summit for maritime security, tech security, economic security, and responses to humanitarian emergency. You study joint statements better than anyone else. So how did this joint statement of the four ministers stack up?
Saw in this joint statement, but also some of the kind of announcements that came out around this, is that you're seeing a phase of the Quad as a platform where they're trying to streamline what they work on. Now, you look at the joint statement, there's a lot of other things and issues, some of which have been kind of carrying over on health security and others from the kind of previous iteration. But you also see an effort to largely fit most things in these kind of four broad baskets, the ones that you outlined. And to me, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I think to the point about a summit, yes, it would be ideal if there was a leader level summit. But to me, if you do a leader level summit, and the substance doesn't come out of it, which is very concrete coordination, consultation, and potentially even collaboration on certain activities, then again, it becomes, to use a DC phrase, a self-licking ice cream cone. You're having these meetings, and there are other minilaterals and groupings that do have, big summit level meetings get lots of attention, but then there isn't really a there when you look at what they're doing. So to me, a streamlined Quad that is maybe meeting much more regularly at the foreign ministers level in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It is these questions, I think, about some of these activities they point out, for example, on the maritime security front, some pretty concrete things that they've mentioned. So we also have a metric with which to measure and see, is there progress in the Quad? On the maritime security side, you saw the operationalization over the last year or so of the Indo-Pacific logistics network, some tabletop exercises. You've also seen things that are continuing, including you saw the first Coast Guard observer at sea mission. Australia obviously doesn't have a Coast Guard as such, but nonetheless, the equivalent participating, and that will continue. India will host the next one. You also saw this announcement of not just the India now operationalizing the Indo-Pacific maritime domain awareness in the Indian Ocean, but, and we need more details on this, a new initiative called the Indo-Pacific Maritime Surveillance, collaborative initiative, which sounds like it's going to put an additional layer in terms of real-time information sharing and enhanced visibility of the maritime domain in this area. I would also say, to me, we often think of the Quad as it needs to, do everything jointly, or we think about the collaboration aspect. But the judge for me is this, to me, I like to think of the Quad best as a coordinating mechanism amongst these four countries. And that means they're not doing necessarily everything only with each other, or that the Quad has to do everything everywhere together. It's a question of, is there a way to share viewpoints, share approaches, deconflict, ideally, have no surprises. So even, for example, in this Quad meeting, discussing what some would consider an out of area crisis, which is the war or the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, which actually does, in India's mind at least, and I think Japan's definition count as the Indo-Pacific. They did this before, after Russia invaded Ukraine. Have the flexibility to have consultations on those kinds of issues, but at the same time also have, President Trump had just gone to China, so have an ability to have that discussion. For example, Secretary Rubio talking to the other partners about what the outcomes of those visits and what lies ahead in U.S.-China relations. So for me, it's the metric of, yes, what they do, but that what they do also means not just activities on the ground or new initiatives, but that ability to consult and coordinate.
Yeah. No, thanks, Tanvi. I mean, it's important to understand where the Quad is right now as you said, a good coordinating mechanism. And, and you mentioned about Trump and Xi meeting, and we're going to get into that. And of course, someone who knows, U.S.-China relations very well is Ken Moriyasu. Previously was one of DC's most well-known journalists with Nikkei, but now, of course, is getting used to the think tank world. So, Ken, I'm going to put you on the spot, but not too much on the spot, because a little over a month ago, you mentioned you weren't as sanguine about the Quad. And I'm going to quote you just because, as a journalist quoting, you say great power competition isn't centered in the Indo-Pacific anymore. It's shifting to the Eurasian heartland, where China and Russia are building a fortress of pipelines, railways, and overland trade routes. Beyond the reach of the US Navy, India may host a BRICS meeting to offset Pakistan renew visibility. But geography is unforgiving. The Himalayas cut India off from China, leaving it to peripheral to Beijing's continental strategy. So it's a great thing to unpack. So I want to ask you this. So in a nutshell, you say the Indo-Pacific matters, but you think that's not where the game is being played right now. And there's merit to it given the focus on packed silica, Central Asia, and critical minerals. So unpack that a little. How did you see the Trump and Xi summit that Tanvi kind of touched on, and how do you see that affecting the Indo-Pacific given the Trump Xi meeting just and then the Quad meeting just happened right after each other?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think the problem with the Quad is that it's a gathering based on our terms, on India, Japan, Australia, America. We think because we're maritime countries, that we are fellow maritime countries, we're fellow democracies, we have the right tools to counter China. But the problem is it doesn't really take into account China's strategy and to formulate strategy to counter that strategy. And what I think is happening over the last 15 years is that China has been slowly moving away from the Indian Ocean because the Indian Ocean is full of choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca. The thinking 15 years ago was that China would continue to depend on oil from the Middle East, and that oil had to come on tankers through the Hormuz, through the Malacca, and that all these choke points were facing the Indian Ocean. Therefore, China will be all over the Indian Ocean, and that there will be a competition between India and China in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, the Indian Ocean will be the center of gravity of geopolitics. What I think has happened over the past 15 years is that China has been trying to escape the Indian Ocean, building pipelines. First, it tried going through Pakistan, Gwadar, and Myanmar, and building the ports and building the pipelines that bring the oil without going through the Malacca Strait. But as we see with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, there's a lot of obstacles for building pipelines through countries like Pakistan. So what it has been doing more recently is directly connecting with Central Asian countries through pipelines like Turkmenistan. The gas, 80% of Turkmenistan's gas now goes to China. Also an oil pipeline to Kazakhstan, and then gas pipelines to Russia. And what I think is happening is that if that if those pipelines grow, then the U.S. Navy will not be able to block Chinese trade in the Malacca Strait. For instance, if there was an operation in Taiwan, China could do it militarily, might be able to do it even today, but the US Navy would immediately block off the Malacca Strait, and then the Chinese economy will dry up. So China's been trying to move away from this choke points and to build a system that is insular from the US Navy. And I think that's what's happening in the Eurasian landmass. So if that's China's strategy, like going through these pipelines that go through Central Asia, then you look at India and China, and there's a huge, tall Himalaya mountain blocking the two countries. And there are no pipelines that can go through the mountains. There are no railways that can pass through those mountains. So if you put yourself in China's shoes, India is irrelevant in this strategy to move away from the Indian Ocean. So I think that's the big structural issue with the Quad. Now, if you look at the joint statement, Sumona said that it was a significant statement, but I don't know about that because many of the topics that we were told were Quad topics in past agreements just don't appear in the joint statement. For instance, in 2021, I was briefed by Kirk Campbell that cooperation in space is one of the topics that the Quad will be pursuing. The four countries will share satellite data. That's not in this joint statement. And in the 2024 Quad, we were told by Jake Sullivan that they also cure cancer. A cancer moonshot was the topic of that summit, but we hear nothing of that in the joint statement. So, the topics regarding the Quad really don't stick. So that's why it's not very convincing that the Quad is really a platform that is central to the Indo-Pacific.
Interesting. I'll use the word play there, Quad not central to Indo-Pacific because there's a lot of Central Asia at play. I want to, obviously, and the good thing about webinar like this, you have differing viewpoints, and that's the whole point of the discourse to kind of get to that. And I'm sure we'll have Tanvi and Sumona weigh in on that as well. But before I do, I have to get to Nishank. Nishank, I think one of my favorite jokes when I first met you is that you epitomize the Quad as someone of Indian origin, grew up in Japan, earned your academic stripes, your PhD in Australia, if I'm not mistaken, and you ride the world of DC policy in the US. So you're the perfect guest. But I want to stay on the topic of critical minerals that Ken touched on a little bit, because a very interesting quote from back in the day, Australian mining magnate Andrew Twiggy Forrest claimed publicly that Australia's own Minister of Mines told him nobody back then wanted to talk critical minerals. That's not the case anymore. And this tracks because historically, even bright Indian students viewed metallurgy engineering as a dinosaur field. It was seen as old school, blast furnaces, heavy industry. There was a lure towards IT, computer science, software, but that's changing now, given battery metals, rare earths are now sparked a sort of debate between urban mining versus digital software, and AI also precludes the efficacy right now of like doing a software engineering course. So I'm just curious right now. We've seen the Australian government working towards scaling its critical mineral resources to rival China's stronghold in supply chains, and you've written and spoken on Japan-Australia model, and you know those very well, which represents this template that Quad countries can use to scale and reduce reliance on China's control of the critical minerals. So how do you look at the launch of the Quad Critical Minerals Initiative and the Indo-Pacific Energy Security Initiative for deeper private sector collaboration?
Thank you, Akshobh. A few points that I want to make is that to see it in the larger context of the critical and rare earth minerals agreement that has been in place with Japan for the last 15 years, and that will help set it as an anchor to see what might be possible with the Quad. So, 2009, there was increasing coercive activities by China against Japan regarding the Senkaku Islands, and as a result of that, China had cut off Japanese industry from significant portions of critical and rare earth minerals. Japan, having learned that lesson, wanted to diversify its dependence from China on a range of those minerals. And it looked to Australia as the solution. So what it did was that it worked with the Japanese government, worked with the Australian government, and invested in a Australian miner called Lynas Rare Earth Minerals. Now, this has been ongoing for about 16 years. So it's taken a significant amount of time, patient capital, successive changes of government, but at the same time, it's allowed for that capital to come in. And why that's really important is that over the last, the way the critical and rare earth stronghold that China has is that it is primed for price manipulation. So you needed to ensure that there's a system in place, an architecture in place that would allow for the Japanese government to continue investing in Lynas, and at the same time, as of lately, that's being negotiate a price floor, such that there's an incentive for mining companies to actually invest and to build out their extractive facilities. Now, moving forward, from Lynas itself, the processing facility is located in Malaysia. And I talked about this last week when I was speaking at another forum. What's interesting about that is that the investment by Japan is continuing to grow. And what this does is it sets it up as a template for what other countries might be able to do in the same capacity. Now, moving to the Quad framework itself, the critical rare earth announcements that were made last week. To me, one of the biggest challenges is that private sector integration when it comes to the Quad remains the key challenge. although the Quad's joint statement acknowledges this directly, the critical minerals framework was designed to coordinate in concert with the private sector. But what industry really needs is bankable projects with defined offtake agreements, regulatory uncertainty, and government co-investment structures that allow for that de-risk capital to come in. So the key point that I would make is that political frameworks on their own don't move capital. And I think that's really important to emphasize. Without money actually flowing into this, backing up this particular statement, it's hard to see where private industry is going to come in. And that's where the role of government is essential to complement private industry. Just one last point I would make is that, and this is to Tanvi's, and I agree, which is that it's not necessary for all the four actors to work in concert to deliver on any of the fronts. It could happen with two or three of them working together. So that is another way to think about the Quad, and also branching outside of the Quad, which is, then we're not talking about the Quad, of course, but thinking about where and how other countries in the Indo-Pacific could also fall in. That's South Korea, that's the Philippines, that's New Zealand. They're all looking to a range of the Quad countries to bolster their own defense capabilities, to bolster their commercial linkages. So there are other opportunities and nodes that can be utilized to further bolster the position when it comes to critical and rare earth minerals. But the key point there is that the political statements need financial backing.
Political statement need financial backing. That's a very interesting point. And obviously, I want to come to Sumona, because a lot of talk about the Quad Investor Network, and you're part of a lot of the, the brain trust that went into making the Quad such a success when you're during your time in government. But I want to ask you, one of the key themes for the episode is also the future of U.S.-China relations, especially after the Trump-Xi summit. And given that the Trump-Xi summit took place, and then segued later the Quad, it's sort of this weird sort of balance, because a lot of the times you obviously the elephant in the room is a dragon. And I just wanted to look back and see, there's this delicate balance of language aimed at deterring Beijing from the Indo-Pacific aggression, but also there was a simultaneous diplomatic effort that we saw to improve relations with China. The Trump-Xi summit sort of was touted by the administration as a success on economic and geopolitical issues that were outstanding, and two of the most powerful economies, of course. But given your many years in government, Sumona, as an FSO and then at the NSE, how do you read the summit's implication, and what did it mean for the Quad?
So I think obviously the Trump-Xi summit was very significant in the fact that it took place. But beyond that, I think the deliverables that, there were sort of least common denominator deliverables, if you will. On the one hand, there was a lot of concern that the president would be very eager to strike some commercial deals and have some diplomatic wins that perhaps would be inconsistent with previous years of U.S. policy, including in the first Trump administration, the stance towards China. So we did not see that happen. And the timing of the Quad foreign ministers is significant, as you pointed out, coming on the heels of that summit. As Tanvi mentioned, it could have been an opportunity, and I hope that it was, for Secretary Rubio to back brief his Quad counterparts on what happened in Beijing. But the Quad itself is more than just hard security issues. As has been noted in the Biden administration, there was a focus on things like vaccine development and distribution in the middle of the global COVID pandemic. On climate change, Ken pointed out that there was a values component as, we're fellow democracies. Ken pointed out the cancer moonshot space, and it just goes to show the level of ambition for the Quad in 2021 was quite high and quite expansive. And what we're seeing now is the Trump administration, again, having built up the Quad in the first term, making a conscious decision to limit it. So the Quad is sometimes referred to as the quadrilateral security dialogue. I think it's way more than security. I think there can be opportunities for the four partners, whether it's in tight coordination or complementary actions, or simply more contact in threat assessments, comparing notes on how to resolve global issues, including in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that there are mixed results for Quad cohesion, but again, the administration has decided to continue the Quad mechanism in the way that it sees fit.
No, I wanted to take that as well to Tanvi, just as where Sumona left it at. Secretary Rubio's first India visit to America as lead envoy served this dual purpose, to reinform and assess and sort of assert the importance of the India partnership in the role of the region, and while simultaneously trying to assure the broader Indo-Pacific that engagement with China would not come at the expense of, regional partnership. And this is not just Quad countries, but all Indo-Pacific countries, particularly, ASEAN countries that have seen sort of Beijing's bellicosity. I wanted to quote something that what Ambassador Nirupama Rao writes. She's former Indian envoy to Washington, to Beijing, and of course, Foreign Secretary. And she writes, the deeper significance of Rubio's Delhi visit, therefore, lies in not what is transformed, but in what is revealed. It's revealed that the India-US relationship has entered a more adult phase and a less sentimental phase. Strategic convergence remains real, but now it coexists openly with, as we talk about trade discussions and any differing geopolitical compulsions, perhaps in the West Asia crisis. So, Tanvi, when we spoke on the show in February 2025, after PM Modi's fleeting visit, we described it as the elevation of US-India relations. A lot has happened since then. Of course, less fanfare right now with Secretary Rubio's visit as compared to Prime Minister Modi's visit in Washington. But how has this elevated the next phase of US-India relationship?
I find it interesting that we always expect when there's a US-India meeting of any sort that they have to be these massive deliverables and fireworks and, new statements and initiatives. You don't really expect that. Like, when there's a US-UK meeting or even a US-Australia one, these are touch points that regularly move a relationship forward. I think this one was important for the reasons kind of you mentioned, that it came also after a period of strain in the relationship and friction. And so it was kind of reinforcing, and it was time to touch base with each other. Both have had developments in their strategic and economic pictures. There's a crisis in the region. So this to me, is a regular touch point, and the idea is to move the ball forward. Sometimes that is going to be, if I start using sports metaphors, I was going to use an American football one that probably doesn't translate. But, you're not always necessarily going to get a touchdown at the end of it or a six. You sometimes get the ones and twos, and it doesn't seem as exciting, but it's still kind of, you're still putting runs on the board. See, I did mix my metaphors in many ways and try to hit every sport. But the point, I think, is, to me, the fact that you did get some movement on critical minerals. The other thing that was I don't think they did a statement this time, kind of a formal joint statement out of the ministerial, but for instance, you did hear External Affairs Minister Jaishankar say they'd agreed to a roadmap for under sea domain awareness. To me, those kind of things are the actual things you want. We'll never see the roadmap. Sumona's been part of developing some of them, but she will tell you, because they're very concrete activities and progress points that are highlighted, and you're supposed to hit them. So to me, these bilateral visits are, yes, about kind of, reassuring each other, discussing things, but it's also, there are concrete things that are decided. They're not always, you're not going to get a nuclear deal out of every visit. And there were discussions on a range of issues. Sometimes you're just talking about what else is happening in the region. I will say, though, and this goes to just kind of to Ken's point, I have a slightly different view, right? To me, every one of the Quad countries, this is not the platform for them in the Indo-Pacific. It is a platform, and there are many others that are for different purposes. And the reason I mention it in the context of the question you ask is, those platforms include these bilateral relationships. So, for instance, if the US and India cooperate on undersea domain awareness, that will be helpful and reinforced by what the Quad does on maritime security. So it is working to a goal, but that doesn't mean, so some of that will be on the bilateral side, to include Eurasia. I mean, it is interesting to hear Ken say that we're forgetting the Eurasian landmass. India has never forgotten the Eurasian landmass. In fact, the standard thing in the bilateral relationship is you heard a lot of folks in India say, well, actually, our real problems are continental, are Eurasian, they're not in the Indo-Pacific. One thing I think people in India have realized, and I think the US has realized this about the continental side, is you can't keep those things separate. The Eurasian landmass and the Indo-Pacific are connected. China's strategy is connected in those domains. And so you're going to have, for example, on, one of the things you saw during this India-US bilateral is talking about some regional issues to include what perhaps the countries are doing in Central Asia, because both are doing things. The US seems a little bit more active there. India has a regular dialogue at the leaders level and at the national security advisor level with Central Asian countries. So I don't think this is an either or. I think the bilateral is moving forward, albeit they're in the face of some pretty severe headwinds in the last year. And so you're not getting those kind of necessarily big movements, but you are seeing progress. I would just say, just like you can't expect the bilateral US-India relationship to do everything, similarly, the Quad can't do everything, and I don't think should try to do everything.
That's interesting there, Tanvi, because you mentioned about the interconnectedness as well, given the Eurasian landmass and the Indo-Pacific are very well intertwined. And obviously, I want to take that to Ken. Ken, there's a lot to touch on there, but I want to build on Nishank's point about critical minerals, because Nishank also touched on very key aspects of Japan as well. And Japan learned a very hard lesson during periods of heightened tension with China. The Senkaku Diaoyu Islands is sort of one of those, also the region perhaps of where Japan got more assertive in the Indo-Pacific as well. And Beijing that time demonstrated its ability to leverage critical mineral supplies for geopolitical purposes. And that sort of experience accelerated Tokyo's push to diversify its sourcing and deepen partnership with partners like Australia. So as we look at today's strategic landscape, how has that episode perhaps shaped a broad economic strategy? Because Tanvi, as a historian, writes a lot about how past things affect our future foreign policy. And I want to ask you about where you see critical minerals becoming one of the strongest pillars of Quad cooperation, given how you spoke about Central Asia. And do you see this as a key focus for the 4 Quad members to reduce dependence on China and build more resilient supply chain?
Yeah, I will talk about critical minerals, but just on the Central Asia issue, yes, I agree that India has a very continental-focused foreign policy as well. But if you put yourselves in the Central Asian government's shoes, they are all landlocked countries looking for access to the seas. And when they look at the possible routes, well, they have the middle corridor that goes through the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, Turkey to the Mediterranean. But the other potential areas are, if Iran stabilizes and becomes a pro-business country, that will be the shortest route for Central Asia countries to go to. Then there is the Afghanistan-Pakistan route, big if there. The third one is making use of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, if that ever materializes. For instance, Kazakhstan already has trains to Xinjiang, and if the CPEC is realized, then without adding any infrastructure, Kazakhstan would have direct access to Gwadar. In their conversation, India does not come out because there is no direct access from Central Asia to India. It has to go through Pakistan. So that's a big if there too. Going to critical minerals, I think we have to, the Quad countries and all the allies, the Western allies, have to identify what the issue is with the critical minerals. It is not a matter of resource scarcity. There is rare earth everywhere in the world. The problem is the bottleneck of the processing. And that processing, 90% of it happens in China. The reason why China has a dominance on the critical minerals processing is because in Deng Xiaoping's area, he identified several areas in China that would focus on rare earth processing. And this involved a lot of chemicals. And you would pour chemicals on, you extract the rare earth critical minerals, and then you would dump the rest, and it was very hazardous and bad for the environment. So all the other countries were reluctant to do this, and that's why China has a dominance over the issue. Until now, the argument was for if the West wants to catch up, they would have to stomach the environmental hazards as well. And then that, quickly hit a dead end. But there is new technology in Israel. There's a startup that is trying to process using electricity. And if we can use electricity to separate the critical minerals without hazardous environmental side effects, that would really expand the production of critical minerals, and that would really break China's stranglehold dominance on this. And it will be one of the most critical crossroads of geopolitics going forward in the next 10 years. So I think all efforts, including the Quad efforts, should be on this processing issue. Like the four countries should bring together the funds and the technology, the expertise to make that breakthrough. It's not a matter of like Japan and Australia identifying the resources, because that is there. That's not the chokehold.
Yeah. No, that's interesting there, Ken. I mean, talking about breaking the chokehold there, because it's a good time to talk about critical minerals. And speaking of breaking that stranglehold, that's what Pax Silica was sort of initiated by. And Nishank, India formally joined Pax Silica in February this year at the India AI Summit. And initially India was not part of it, but now India's part of it, and it's become the 12th member. And this is another step in the U.S. India partnership, as you write about here. It's a step for boosting India's semiconductor, AI, and of course, critical minerals ambitions. And also, the Ken says, breaking the stronghold and the stranglehold of, Chinese supply dominance. But at the same time, as data reports, and I'm trying to look at the current, most recent data, India currently imports, I think, over 53,000 tons of rare earth magnets annually and heavily dependent on external energy sources. So just from a geopolitical risk standpoint, how does Pax Silica board for genuine diversification of India's dependencies, and how do you see this aligning with the Quad's initiatives, given now it has all four Quad partners?
So there's a range of different frameworks all kind of squashed in together. So I'm going to try and disentangle them. The way I look at it is that it is in increasing weaponized interdependence. If there's a country, whether it's India or any other country that is remaining, that is outside of that supply chain coalition, that itself is a strategic vulnerability. So India has made that calculation that it's going to be part of Pax Silica. Is it the only thing that's going to be involved in? No, it isn't. It's going to diversify. It's going to look for other avenues where it can actually secure the resources that it needs for its own domestic ambitions. It doesn't want to be just a consumer of critical and emerging technologies, but it also wants to be a supplier. It wants to also be able to go out and set standards, because if there are Indian standards or agreed standards that India is part of, that means AI, indigenous GPU clusters, and so on would be competing more effectively vis-a-vis China. So in one way, the Pax Silica reduces Chinese dependency, but we still need to see where that goes. This is still a relatively new initiative when it comes to reducing their dependency in critical minerals and semiconductors. And at the same time, it explicitly, for India and other members that are part of it, it deepens alignment with the US technology governance preferences, including on AI regulation, export controls, as well as trusted vendor definitions as these definitions and standards emerge. It is still very much a fluid space. So in one way, India is exchanging from one dependency for a more distributed and politically acceptable one. So it is. That's the way I see it. Pax Silica, it's still incredibly new, so we have to wait and see what happens in that space. And on the just another point that I wanted to make on critical and rare earth minerals is that this is not to compete with what's happening, but rather in terms of another way to address the shortages, and that is through critical and rare earth minerals recovery and recycling processes. Japan is quite a leader in this field. I've been looking at and working with a few Japanese companies who are probably amongst the top that are experts in recovery of critical and rare earth minerals, which they use for their own domestic industry. Now, it's not a substitute, but the recognition that there's actual real gold, to use that metaphor, in what we throw away, and to recover that through increasingly more economic and efficient extraction methods, that is really key. So we can talk about a little bit more, what are some Japanese companies that are leaders in this particular field who are playing an increasingly important role in helping Japan diversify its own dependence and using that technology, whether that's in the context of the Quad or even bilaterally, to help other countries get out of that stranglehold.
Mm. No, thanks for that, Nish. And sorry if I unpacked too much into it, because with the finite time and your expertise, I wanted to get in as much as I could. But thank you for peeling the onion layers a little there. Sumona, you recently wrote about American desire to outperform rather than fight China. And, during the previous administration, NSA Jake Sullivan outlined in 2022 the concept of small yard, high fence, referring to Washington's strategic approach to economic and technological relations with China, this policy to protect highly sensitive core national security technologies. And I was just mentioning to Tanvi as well. Ambassador Rao, former foreign secretary and ambassador to Beijing and Washington, wrote, one should not exaggerate the emergence of a formal G2. The United States and China remain locked in deep structural competition. Yet there's a language of strategic stability after President Trump's Beijing visit inevitably raises question in Asia about whether, the Washington's priorities are shifting. So if the US and China move a little more towards, a stable partnership, how does that affect the Quad? Can a US-China détente still accentuate the Quad's purpose? Because it was always seen as very contravening, but can it, uh, accentuate where the Quad's relevance still is?
I do think it's possible to hold both things at the same time. I mean, first, I should say that, the longstanding US policy of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and supporting the status quo, that remains in place. And although there was uncertainty around the Trump's summit with Xi, nothing he said dramatically deviated from that posture. There was some concern that there would be a deviation and some sort of accommodation on Taiwan, and that did not happen. So I should set the scene with that first. But again, if you conceive of the Quad as having the potential to do more, or the positive externalities of the Quad, shall we say, do more than just hard security issues, then I absolutely do think it's possible that you can continue a strong and effective Indo-Pacific Quad while also seeking to moderate any tension between the United States and China, at least tactical sort of tension. I agree with Ambassador Rao that the strategic competition actually remains in place. It is a forum, the Quad is a forum for like-minded partners to take steps to work together on the pressing issues of the day. Picking up on Nishank's comments about aligning on AI regulations, I mean, this is a very important point, as there are new technologies and countries all over the world, including the United States, are grappling with how to situate these new technologies in their economies and their societies. What are the impacts on their societies? It is very worthwhile to have conversations about how are you handling these issues, the potential for regulatory alignment so that companies can work together. You see this, we saw this in terms of internet governance, which was the question of 10 years ago. How are countries facing that? And there you see China in one place and much of the world in a different place. So I do think these positive externalities are very worthwhile, and you can hold both things true at the same time.
Um, Both things true at the same time. Is that the never thought the juxtaposition of closer U.S.-China relations would also accentuate the Quad's relevance, because for the first few years, the Quad kept on justifying how it was not an Asian NATO, was not against any country. But that's interesting now because, Tanvi, CNAS and Richard Fontaine put out a great report a while ago called Global Swing States. And for the political junkie in me, it was this interestingly very political, American political term with a geopolitical twist. And, you studied India's foreign policy and better than anyone else. And India's long leverage its global swing state status as a strategic asset, call it strategic autonomy or what you will. And your book, Fateful Triangle, I mean, you literally wrote the book on U.S. India China triangular dynamics. Great read for anyone who hasn't read it about during the Cold War and how China's influence brought U.S. and India together in some ways. I wanted to look through your historical lens here, because today's US India China triangular dynamic represents something new. China still probing for leverage in some ways. The US viewing India as an indispensable partner in the region, not so much during the Cold War. And India wanting more of the US in the Indian Ocean, not less. What part of this sort of rhymed with earlier moments in the Cold War when New Delhi tried to balance between Washington and Beijing? And also, there's a lot of talk about can India still sustain the swing state model, just foreign policy ambiguity, and where does US-China competition sort of, make New Delhi shift its foreign policy calculus?
So do we have another hour? That's a lot, but let me just say, and I'll connect it to something Sumona said on the China front. I think the reason to some extent this is a triangle is that even and I won't mention the Quad, but I'll talk about if you're Indian looking at what happens in US-China relations, even a temporary détente can have implications for you if, for example, strategic stability that has been agreed to impinges on your interest. If it means that in the next India-China crisis, you'll have a US that will sit on the sideline. If it means that if there is a Taiwan Strait crisis, the US will take a different view. If it means that when China is island building or changing the status quo in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, the US will not be as vociferous about its objection or not coordinate. So I'm not saying those things will necessarily happen, but that part of it is, yes, in an ideal view, even on the Quad or in US India, you saw this in previous administrations before a major US-China summit or a ministerial, you'd see administrations actually engage with allies, engage even with the Quad, so that it almost, gave the US more strength and leverage as they went into negotiations, or at least make sure and schedule something in parallel. So then there is this kind of signaling to China that the Quad or these relationships are not something that are going to be a bargaining chip, that these are something that will continue regardless. So I think, if you're India, as you're thinking about your posture, whether it's vis-a-vis US-China competition, one thing you are doing is watching that very closely because it will directly affect your interests. It will affect the way the US sees and prioritizes India, and it affects the way potentially China behaves in the region. Historically, a China that is feeling more comfortable with the US tends to put more pressure on its neighbors. Japan is experiencing this right now. And the question for India always is, are they going to see that phase with China as well? And so that's why you're seeing India, the India's stabilization effort with China precedes the Trump administration, or the Trump 2.0 at least. But it nonetheless that effort has been reinforced because they do not want to see a crisis in an environment where both externally and internally they've got a lot of headwinds right now. But I will just say on the swing state, I think where history is limited in terms of this is not so much on the US-China-India triangle, but when people are thinking about India's choices, if US-China competition ends up being kind of a bipolar framework, people tend to think of it naturally as people don't use the word new Cold War anymore, but people tend to think that India will do the same thing, be non-aligned, walk a middle path, or that strategic autonomy will mean that India will try to keep equidistant relationship. I think that is where, the framing is very different today. Not because of anything to do with, necessarily kind of India's wanting to change its foreign policy. It is because in this Cold War or superpower competition, if you would use that, India has direct disputes with one of the superpowers. That was not the case with the Soviet Union. And it is, in fact, using its relationship with the US to help solve its China problem. So this is a very different kind of posture that India has, where yes, it is even as it has concerns about US reliability, about occasionally US coerciveness, but at the end of the day, it doesn't have direct disputes with the US. It has concerns about the US vis-a-vis its approach to Pakistan or on tariffs, etc. But at the end of the day, it is aligning very clearly through bilaterally, through the Quad, through other mechanisms to help shape a favorable balance of power in Asia and to build its own resilience and resilience in the region. So I think this is a very different posture, even as India tries to, at the end of the day, build its own capabilities, which is at the heart of any strategic autonomy, and what Nish referred to, which is diversify. Make sure it's not just dependent on US relationship to deal with China, but to make sure it has a diversified set of partnerships, and it's keeping its relationship or managing its relationship with China in a way that keeps some of its options open. So I think it depends on what you mean by swing state. This is not India kind of like a pendulum, essentially centered and then occasionally swinging one way or the other. To the extent that I think the swing state definition is, can you swing the balance of power? Can you make a difference? And I think the US has one of the reasons the US is engaged with India is that even if India doesn't do things with the US or for the US, that by its very weight, it can complicate China's calculations. And I think that's still true. That's still true today.
I wish we had another hour where I would love to unpack all the details with all of you guys, and you have so much to add. But obviously, that's when the finite time we have. And as we get to the business end as well, I want to quickly get Ken and Nishank. I mean, Ken, first you, given you bring the Japan lens to this quad discussion, and Tanvi spoke about posturing, but interesting posturing at the Shangri-La dialogue. We saw Japan specifically condemn Beijing for its aggressive military buildup. Comes a few months after Japanese PM Sane Takahashi said Japan could intervene if China attacked Taiwan. That's always been this concern after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and similar parallels have been drawn. And of course, this brings into the security and the semiconductor aspect. I wanted to ask, after the Trump-Xi summit, how does Tokyo feel? Does it feel unsettled or more reassured about its national security? Also, in the context of the Quad FM meeting in New Delhi, Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific security infrastructure at times, what does it see right now? The way Washington's moving towards or away, as you said, from the Indo-Pacific. So how does that affect Tokyo's calculus?
Yeah, so nobody knows what Donald Trump is thinking, but I think it's important for Japan to be clear-eyed about what China is trying to do and to consult Trump and make sure that both sides are on the same page. So what just taking China's recent criticism of Japan's so-called remilitarization, I think it's important to step back and understand what's happening here. I think in January, when the Trump administration conducted its operations in Venezuela, China really couldn't do anything. So that was a weak response. In the two strikes on Iran last year and this year, China really couldn't do anything. So that's another weakness. So, President Xi has to look strong somewhere. And I think Japan is a low-risk adversary that it can safely punch, knowing that it won't punch back, and the tensions won't rise to the level that the US will intervene. So I think that's what's happening, number one. Number two, in the recent Trump-Xi summit, the two sides came up with this new wording called a constructive strategic stability partnership. And I think it's important for the Trump administration to, although the US side also wants stability, it's very important to be clear-eyed what China is doing here. For the longest time, China was always a competitor or a challenger, all these negative connotations when describing China. Now it's a constructive strategic partner for stability, which is a very positive meaning. So very quietly, China has succeeded in removing the negative aspects of its description. I don't know if the Trump administration understands this. Thirdly, most importantly, if you listen to what Xi Jinping said in his meeting with Trump, according to the Chinese readout, the first thing he said is transformation unseen in a century is happening, accelerating, and the international situation is becoming fluid and turbulent. So, as a journalist covering the world, I don't think 2026 is a once-in-a-century year. I think it's just a normal year. I mean, if you look back, 1989, the Berlin Wall, maybe that was a very historic year. 2001, the 9/11, that was definitely a historic year. 2003, 175,000 US troops, the coalition troops invading Iraq. That was a historic year. 2026 is just a normal year. But why is Xi Jinping saying this? If you put yourself in his shoes, I think he sees China rising, America declining. And that is the official Chinese talking point. I think he believes his own propaganda. And the danger here, I don't think, well, I do agree that China's rising. I don't think the America is declining. But if Xi believes in that propaganda, he might take action based on that wrong assumption. So I think that is troubling to see. But either way, I think it's important for the US and Japan to be on the same page to understand what China's trying to do.
Yeah, what China's trying to do. I mean, it's hard to even figure out, what the TDs rated pardon the pun over there of what the CCP and Xi Jinping are thinking about. And Nishank, Ken mentioned that 2026 is not an unusual year. It's just business as usual. Of course, no one can compete with 1989, and given what a seminal year it was, because the world geopolitics looked a lot different then. But I wonder what happened unprecedented this year was, of course, the crisis in West Asia with the Iran war. And, and in the last few episodes, we've kind of have veered towards West Asia. And to Tanvi's point, West Asia is connected with the Indo-Pacific, so it's not so much an aberration. But West Asia crisis made its mention in the joint statement, as the leader said, uninterrupted flow of global commerce to the Strait of Hormuz and Red Sea. And the Gulf has sort of demonstrated this interconnectedness with Indo-Pacific and West Asia theaters, right? For India, the Strait of Hormuz it's not an abstract part. It's just not just a vital supply chain, but energy for given the energy corridors it has, shipping routes, and we talk about diaspora and remittance from the Gulf. Do you see this as a new reality that shaped bilateral discussion during Secretary Rubio's visit and the Quad meeting itself? The synchronity between West Asia and the Quad that's forcing Quad countries, especially India, which are more affected, to really think about how one country's actions would affect the other Quad members.
How I would characterize that is that there's no doubt that they're Indo-Pacific and the West Asia are interconnected intimately, and it depends where you are. Some countries are going to face those pressure points far more acutely than others, and you've identified some of those key areas in the remarks that you just made. The five that really stand out to me. And again, it depends how badly you're affected by it, how much resilience you have to be able to cope with those shocks, and then have measures in place in your own domestic economies to bounce back from it. Something that being a shock absorber. One is economic security. Second is energy security. Third is the free flow of commerce. Fourth is movement of people, and fifth is about the ability of people who are actually in those communities to be able to sustain themselves. The combination of, and it's not just limited to these five particular areas. So the two theaters, are extremely connected. And from India's position, we know it has inflationary effects, and that's not just limited to India. It's happening across if you just look at the price of gas in countries worldwide, is having a adversarial impact over there. It is going up. But to be able to tease them out, that is not something that I would be looking to do, because of the core five areas that I mentioned are how intrinsically they are connected. And one key point that I want to make is that despite the measures that were taking place with the bombing last June and this year in February, is that the behavior set for Iran hasn't necessarily changed. So it's going to be it's going to be incredibly important to see what are their negotiating points, how are they, how can they be incentivized to cooperate? Because we know from previous engagements by them, they're masters in stringing things out. So from India's standpoint, even as Australia or going as far as Japan, the two theaters are intimately connected. They are interlocking security dilemmas and strategic challenges there that each of the four Quad countries have to grapple with.
Each of the four countries have to grapple with. And Nishank, we cannot have timed this better because right at 10:30 and it's a witching hour. And so I am delighted. And as Tanvi said, I wish we had another one more hour to unpack everything. Tanvi's research on US, India, China, Sumona's time from working on Quad at the NSC, and Ken's time as a journalist. And of course, Nishank, you cover all four Quad countries from your own personal and professional endeavors. But, I want to thank you all, Tanvi, Sumona, Ken, Nishank. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone joining us. Thank you for everyone watching on YouTube. And of course, this will be up later. And until the next episode, it's goodbye for now. Have a pleasant week ahead. Thank you, everyone.